Welcome, everyone. Today, we're going to be talking about ultranationalism in Germany. Some of this is going to be a bit of a review from our World War II lectures and also from our stages of genocide. Now, you should have watched that, and hopefully, you've watched the lecture on the Rwandan genocide as well. So, I'm not going to spend any time talking about what the stages of genocide are. We'll encounter that in this lecture. But I want you to be keeping all those things in mind as we go over this stuff. There's also going to be several videos that you need to watch after this to complement this. And I want you to be taking into consideration, again, the personal implications in these events. Something like the Holocaust did not happen because of one person. It's extremely important that we recognize that. No one individual is powerful enough on this planet to murder 6-7 million people. It takes an extreme amount of organization and cooperation from a population to do that. So, ultranationalism, extreme devotion to or advocacy of the interests of a nation, especially regardless of the effect on any other nation. This is a very important definition for us. Now, it's different, but not that much from nationalism. The main extent that we see the difference here, though, is the regardless aspect. So, furthering your nation with no care about the negative effects it has on others. So that's why we see genocides occurring. And again, you should know this definition by now. Genocide's an act committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. This was coined by a Polish Jew in 1944. Could not find a word to describe the inhumanity of the Nazis. So why do these occur? Well, let's get into some of this. Again, we went over some of this information when we were talking about World War II and Hitler's rise to power and the rise of fascism in Europe at the time. But so we see the Nazi Party coming to power, Nationalist Socialist German Workers' Party. Now, even though it has the word socialist in it, this party falls on the extreme right end of the political spectrum. This is something that a lot of people either forget or don't understand. It's an important distinction, though. They became the Nazi Party under Hitler, who gained power in 1933. Now, if you remember from the previous lectures, Hitler decided after the failed beer hall push that gaining power through legitimate means was more important to further your goals than capturing power through a revolution or a coup. So they gain power legitimately and slowly consolidate this power. One of the terms the Nazi Party uses is blood and soil. Now, this is something that you hear in a lot of racist propaganda or an ultranationalist. This is the reason, though, for the red and black on their flag. So the blood aspect, this is that racial purity that the Nazis were pushing. Things like that pure Aryan race, that European stock. There was also a rejection of democracy. But then the soil aspect, this is that living space. The German term that was used was Lebensraum. So you want to have a place, like a physical geographic place for your pure race to live. So blood and soil is about that racially defined national body, unified with a settlement area, giving people somewhere to live. Now, this Lebensraum that the Nazis were, we could say, capturing, lots of this is in Eastern Europe, specifically Poland. So there'd be German farms. Polish people were kicked off of their land, sometimes used as servants, maybe even on their own land. That's if they weren't killed or shipped to concentration camps. Here we see a belief in rural values, hard work, and very stereotypical gender roles. So kind of that belief that a sturdy woman who could raise a home, this is what females were supposed to be like. This term blood and soil, it's not only used in the 30s and 40s, though. In 2017, when there was the march in Charlottesville, blood and soil was chanted at that rally. So this is a term that still gets used by people who are pushing that ultra-nationalist agenda. So Hitler coming to power. 1933, the Enabling Act is passed. So the Nazis can now pass laws without the approval of the Reichstag. Hitler creates a single-party state, and so he now has the power. They said this is only going to last for 4 years. What happened, though, is we saw the Reichstag fire. So the Nazis then abolished civil liberties. They placed the blame on other individuals, specifically communist Jews, and they transferred power to the Reich government. This created, though, a legal government. This was not something that, again, they didn't overthrow somebody. They gained power through legal means and then twisted the law to consolidate the power. Non-Nazi members were surrounded and threatened by SA and SS. Communists weren't able to vote. And eventually, since all other political parties were banned, it was easy to renew the Enabling Act, creating a legal dictatorship. So even though it was supposed to only last 4 years, it extends much longer. One of the things that was used to help spread ideas and power was Hitler Youth. So Hitler breeds the future of Germany through the youth of the country. Right? There's that saying, children are the future. Well, in Nazi Germany, they were the future Nazis. So they used indoctrination in schools. They told what was truth. I might have mentioned this in another lecture, but one of the things that we would see here is things like in school, they would be adding into their curriculum these racist, ultra-nationalist ideologies. There'd be things like in math, they would they would solve problems that would discuss how much money a child with disabilities costs the state. They would then look at, well, how much would the state save by exterminating these individuals? These are sort of things that we see happening in schools and in the Hitler Youth. The emphasis here was, especially for the males, it was on military, masculinity, toughness, and preparation for military. You don't want weak sissy boys when you're trying to take over the world. And so the idea here was get rid of any sort of, maybe we could even say like empathy, and just build that aggressiveness. For the girls in these programs, it was more about that home training, developing domestic skills. So here's some images showing the Hitler Youth. Very similar to things like the Boy Scouts or the Girl Guides, with a racist twist. So the Holocaust begins. Well, Hitler had two main goals: establish a Central European empire to create Lebensraum for his people, and eliminate Jewish populations from the lands gained by Germany. So Germany needed somebody to blame for the poor economy. Jewish people become the scapegoat. Here's a book at the time. The title of it is Jews Are Parasites. So here you will see some of those different stages of genocide. Clear dehumanizing speech calling a group parasites. Now it is worth just for a moment discussing that this is not the first time Jewish people experienced racism, especially in Europe. These sort of things have gone on for hundreds, if not thousands of years. There's been lots of racism pushed towards Jewish people. And so in Europe, there's different time periods where Jewish people have been discriminated against, kicked off their land. There were pogroms in other regions towards them. So this is not necessarily an isolated incident. It is representative of a long time of these sort of feelings. Now, what are some to have a genocide occur? You need common qualities between all victims. So people are blamed for the ills of the country. They're fewer in number, and oftentimes it's believed that they have an advantage in the country, and so they're seen as removable. Well, I already talked about this slide, so I'll just mention here that this wall is a picture of the Budapest ghetto. Final pieces of this were removed in 2006. If you remember from the stages of genocide, ghettos were created for organization. They built these sections in cities that were closed off so that once you were put in there, you couldn't get out. Oh, my apologies. It would then be easy to have a train roll up to the ghetto and put everybody on there. So this is just a picture of one wall from the ghetto. Leading up to the beginning of the Holocaust, one of the first major acts of discrimination that we see, at least when it turns quite violent, is Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. Now, this occurred the nights of November 9th to 10th in 1938. So a German diplomat had been killed in Paris 2 nights before, and so Hitler orders a night of terror on Germany and its annexed land. What happens is over the course of that night, 90 Jewish people are killed. Over 1,000 synagogues are lit on fire. A synagogue, if you're not familiar with that, that's a Jewish house of worship. Thousands of Jewish businesses are looted. 30,000 Jewish males are sent to concentration camps or placed under house arrest. What's important here, though, is that this is carried out by both the military, police, and civilians. Again, one thing you should have taken from some of these previous lectures, genocides are not occurring without the support of civilians, regular people that have, for some reason, become swayed by the speech going on. So when these Jewish businesses and synagogues are being looted and burnt to the ground, police are standing there either just looking on, not caring, or even taking part as well. Another thing worth mentioning is that this was widely reported around the world. Newspapers reported on this the next day all across the planet. In Canada and the United States, we knew that these stages of genocide were occurring and progressing. We saw that this discrimination was happening, and yet nothing was done about it. In fact, Canada even turned away a ship of Jewish refugees, sent them back to Europe, where most of them ended up being killed in the genocide. So Canada's role here too, we have implications. So the night, or the term Kristallnacht, this literally comes from broken glass that lined the street afterwards. Now, you might remember as well that Nuremberg laws were passed in 1935, restricting things like who Jewish people could marry and other things like that. So this is not the first act of discrimination, but we really see it escalate here. This map shows ghettos in occupied Europe. So there's different colors designating when they were established, but what you'll see is there were many. And again, these ghettos were part of that organization and preparation for the Holocaust, or the final solution. Some of these still exist. I've been in the Warsaw ghetto. Today, it obviously looks much different. You can still see the walls around it. But there were lots. And again, most of these were in Eastern Europe. So the land where you see these ghettos, this was where they wanted their Lebensraum. Here's a few images from different ghettos. So that top left image is saying that Jews were forbidden from crossing that checkpoint. You can see the yellow Star of David on the fence in one, again, symbolizing, classifying, so people knew who you were, what group you belonged to. And again, the walls separating individuals. It was very, like, within these ghettos, life was hard, but people were still with some of their families. They were operating businesses. But over the course of World War II, more and more was being learned about what was happening. And so the ghettos were getting emptied out. In 1941, the final solution starts being undertaken. This is when Hitler orders all Jewish people to be gathered and quickly disposed of by transporting them to extermination camps, which is easy because of the use of ghettos in Europe. This image here is the entrance to Auschwitz-Birkenau. This was the largest concentration and extermination camp that was used. Over 1 million people were killed in Auschwitz alone. I traveled there in 2008. It's a very somber place. While not all the buildings are still there, you walk through and you can see the collections of items like eyeglasses from people who were killed, or dolls, or shoes. The magnitude and the scale of what happened there is quite incomprehensible, but you get an idea of it when you're there. This map shows where different concentration camps were. Again, spread throughout both Germany and other Eastern European countries. And this map also shows where some of the extermination camps were. Now, not every concentration camp was used for mass killing. That mass killing was done mostly at the big extermination camp. So on here, it's symbolized with the skull and crossbones. So in both of these camps, though, people who were there, so Jewish people, homosexuals, the Roma, people with disabilities, they were also used as labor. So they would be working to produce things for the war effort. And these are some images from the concentration camps. And these are not easy images to look at, but we have the privilege of looking at them 80 years after it happened. Removing ourselves from the past doesn't do anything to help. We can be grateful we never went through this, but millions upon millions did. Pictures here show crematoriums. So something had to be done with all the bodies that were killed at these concentration camps. So sometimes they were put in mass graves, but oftentimes they were burned. Over 6 million Jewish people and other undesirables were exterminated. Over 1.5 million of these were children. 5,000 Jewish communities wiped out. These numbers are tragic. It's hard to have any sort of grasp about how many people this actually is. I believe it was about maybe 30 to 40% of the entire Jewish population in the world. Now, after World War II, many of the key players in Nazi Germany were put on trial in Nuremberg. This took place in between 1945 and 1946. 22 people were tried, charged with things like conspiracy, war crimes, wars of aggression, crimes against humanity. 11 of them were sentenced to death, 6 given various prison times, 3 acquitted, and 2 didn't make it to trial, 1 because of suicide and 1 deemed mentally unfit. Now, as you can probably figure out, 22 people, it took a lot more than that to carry out the Holocaust. Now, interestingly enough, even today and in the last several years, some individuals who took part in it, people that worked in some of these concentration camps, they actually are still being tried and charged. There's actually been individuals that have been deported from Canada to go for trial in Germany. And so this is something that it went on more and more. But the Nuremberg trials were quite famous for charging people with some of these war crimes. Now, there's all sorts of interesting stories about people who went and hunted down Nazis after World War II, and some of this stuff is true. But the impacts of the Holocaust are unimaginable for people that went through it. One of the things afterwards it's worth maybe talking about for just a few moments is that at the end of World War II, we end up seeing the creation of Israel. So prior to this, the land was Palestine, and this was part of the Ottoman Empire. After World War I, more and more immigration begins. Jewish people immigrating to Palestine. Between 1929 and 1938, about 250,000 Jewish people arrived in Palestine. So we start seeing a large influx of people leaving Europe, especially moving into Palestine. We see the Balfour Declaration in 1917. The British government viewed favorably towards creating Palestine into a Jewish homeland. There was a Zionist movement, so kind of increasing the movement towards Israel. But in 1936 to 1938, immigration was restricted to Palestine. We started seeing fascist regimes emerge and the persecution of Jewish people increasing throughout Europe. And the Jewish people had nowhere to go. Every country in the world was closed to Jewish immigration, and there were only 75,000 Jewish people allowed to immigrate to Palestine during World War II. So some tried to immigrate illegally, but very few managed to escape during World War II. Like I mentioned, Canada also turned away refugees from Israel during this war. So after the war, the United Nations created a partition plan. And on the 14th of May, 1948, the State of Israel was declared, and it was recognized by the world's two superpowers. So since 1948, Israel has been a land where Jewish people have lived. This, though, the history does not stop there. And there's been a lot of turmoil since. But it's worth talking a little bit about that.